let's start. I see we've already got well over 150 people on, and I think we have about 350 signed up. I'm Steve Orlins. I'm president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. And if you don't recognize me, it's because I've been in quarantine for the last 5 weeks. It's a difficult time, obviously, especially for those of us sitting in Manhattan, where more than 10,000 fellow New Yorkers have passed away as a result of coronavirus. However, we fundamentally believe that continuing to educate about China and continuing to maintain productive relations between the United States and China saves lives. So we're very happy to have 3 outstanding experts with us today who are all part of the National Committee family. This is the first in a series of programs, virtual programs, we're going to be doing that will address how we should be thinking about U.S.-China relations in this COVID-19 era. The next one we'll do will be on April 22nd with Graham Allison, and then we'll do another on April 28th with former FDA head Peggy Hamburg and Winnie Yip, a professor at the Chan School of Public Health at Harvard. As I said, we've got 3 absolutely fabulous experts. We'll start the program with each of them talking for about 10 minutes on the current state of U.S.-China relations, each focusing on their field of expertise. So economics and business for Amy, politics for Yuen, and civil society for Elizabeth. I'll then ask some questions, then I'll open the floor to questions. We already have, I think, more questions than we can possibly answer in our hour and a half. So let's get started. I won't read the full bios of all 3 and all of their accomplishments, because if I did, we wouldn't have any time for the conversation. Just in brief, Yuen Yuen Ang is a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, and of course, very importantly, a member of the National Committee's Public Intellectuals Program. Amy Celico is a principal at Albright Stonebridge Group, who leads that firm's DC-based China practice and is on the board of the National Committee. Elizabeth Knup, who is country director for China for the Ford Foundation, a former employee of the National Committee, and also now serves on its board. So let me kick it off with Amy to talk about kind of what's going on in the economic relationship and what coronavirus has done to that.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for inviting me to join Yuen, Elizabeth, and you for this conversation. It's an honor to be among all of you today. And let me dive right in. I'll say something pretty obvious to everybody, but I think it's really important to underscore. Here in 2020, the bilateral commercial relationship between the US and China is incredibly challenged. In fact, it's hard to think of a time when what used to be described as the ballast or the stabilizer of the overall relationship has been so fraught. This leads me to be pretty sober about the prospects for this aspect of the relationship in the long term, but I do think COVID-19, in addition to the many, many challenges it brings, also does present some opportunities for the economic relationship. Let me be frank, in China, in the United States, and across the globe, the stakes for the economic relationship have been raised dramatically by COVID-19. But let's first assess where we are. Despite so much opportunity and interest in bilateral economic activity among our companies, our universities, and localities in both countries, including significant revenues that have been generated from bilateral goods and services trade, the commercial relationship between the US and China continues to struggle with fundamental challenges. As you know, there are long-standing accusations against China of depriving American and other foreign investors of a level playing field to compete in the China market through the use of protectionist and unfair trade practices that distort global markets. More recently, the U.S. government has been accused of allowing an overzealous bleeding of national security issues into economic policymaking to ramp up investment restrictions, export controls, and other limitations on technology trade that are unduly impacting American competitiveness. They're also depriving local economies across the United States of investors and not making the United States more secure in the process. And on both sides of the Pacific, there's been a tit-for-tat application of tariffs on trade flows that has impacted more than $700 billion in goods flowing between our two countries over the past almost 2 years of a trade war. Tariffs that were justified in the US not only to bring China to the negotiating table on trade and market access issues, but also to help promote a broader economic decoupling of our interconnected economies on political and economic grounds. So even before COVID-19 put an even bigger strain on this element of the relationship, commercial ties between our two countries have been in dire straits, and these restrictions put on trade by our governments has led companies to accelerate a process of diversifying, I'll say, rather than decoupling, where and how they source goods and services. So for my clients at Albright Stonebridge Group, what they're seeing as they're trying to work in the China market is their Chinese customers looking to their competitors, non-US suppliers of goods, and seeking non-US markets for sales, investments, and services trade opportunities. My clients themselves have had to grapple with questions of how to remain in China for China while diversifying global supply chains to avoid tariffs, export controls, and other restrictions placed by the US government on trade. This ironically, of course, has meant that the US market has not been a very attractive alternative while diversifying. So against this backdrop, let me at least highlight two positive things in 2020 vis-a-vis the economic relationship. First is with regards to the trade agreement between the United States and China. This phase one trade agreement, given how negative the economic relationship had become, was very, very warmly welcomed by the US business community. 3 months ago, yesterday, it was signed. And it was a very positive development, if for no other reason than it took some of the tension out of the economic relationship. But of course, the agreement was limited. While indeed it had some very good elements, it also had flaws. It focused on purchase agreements that can only be characterized, particularly by our other trading partners, as managed trade. And it left many of our other trading partners deeply troubled by the weight of those significant and unrealistic purchase agreements of agriculture, energy goods, services, and manufactured goods on their own ability to trade with China this year and next year. So these commitments to purchase an additional $200 billion in US goods and services over the next 2 years over 2017 levels were unrealistic in January. Today, of course, it will be frankly impossible to achieve due to COVID-19, although we did just overnight get good economic data about agricultural trade with China over the past 2 months, mainly due to increased purchases by China of soybean and pork. But I think one of the biggest shortcomings of the phase one trade agreement was it left most of the tariffs in place. And so this is something, while the US government has stressed is necessary to use as leverage for phase two trade negotiations, this impacts even the current purchase commitments that China has made, since the tariffs still apply to most of the purchases of US farm goods, energy products, and this squeezes the margins for US sellers. But as I said, let me at least highlight one positive element of the Phase 1 trade agreement. As we've seen over the past 3 months since the deal was signed, this Phase 1 trade agreement has offered a very important area of productive cooperation between the US and China. Implementation of the commitments made in January have been moving forward, according to the U.S. Trade Representative, the Treasury Secretary, President Trump and President Xi, of course, and our 2 ambassadors. And despite increased tensions in the overall relationship, and of course now the global health pandemic that we face, this at least has been one area where the US and China can point to progress. So my former colleagues at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office have pointed to progress that China has made on process and on substance. In addition to purchase commitments, the Chinese government has made some market liberalization announcements per the terms of the agreement on schedule. And where COVID-19 has impacted some other commitments that China was due to make, mainly because the National People's Congress didn't meet on schedule in March, China continues to talk in a very fulsome manner about how it will continue to make these market access commitments come to life for American companies. So, as I said before, of course, the agreement is far from perfect. It keeps most of the tariffs in place and saves most of the very difficult but critical issues in the bilateral relationship to future Phase 2 negotiations. Phase 2 negotiations that in the current political and now global economic climate are very unlikely to happen anytime soon. But given where we are today due to COVID-19, this agreement was important in that it did reestablish channels of communication on economic issues between the United States and China. And it's worth highlighting and celebrating since we're going to need these channels in the coming months. Maybe that's not a huge positive, but it's a necessary one. And we should pocket it and put these channels of communication to good use in the month ahead. My second and final point that I'd like to highlight is about the business climate in China. One of the very, very few silver linings of COVID-19 has been that it seems to have reinforced and reinvigorated talk on the ground in China about the important role of foreign investors in China's growth trajectory. While last May through the end of 2019, we were hearing threats from the Chinese government about the unveiling of an unreliable entities list, increasing calls for self-reliance, both in response to US government actions. Now we're seeing China rolling out assistance and reassurance to foreign and domestic companies as the government grapples with the devastating impact of COVID-19. And so in the wake of the pandemic, Chinese officials have been assisting foreign companies with supply chain bottlenecks and helping them to restart production. China continues to talk about plans to expand market access for foreign insurance providers, to release a new and shorter negative list of the sectors of the economy that are closed to foreign investment, and take further steps to open new parts of the economy to foreign investors. Of course, COVID-19 is pushing a new conversation about the vulnerability of global supply chains, which we can get into later. But I do want to end by just saying again how promising it is that the Chinese government, in what is going to be a dramatically and historically bad year for the Chinese economy, is highlighting the role of foreign investors and the role of trade in China's recovery efforts. I only hope that our two countries together will take action in that same spirit, perhaps by eliminating more of the tariffs that remain in place to help our economies recover and deal with this pandemic. I'll leave it there, Steve. Thanks so much.
Amy, fabulous. That was a great way to kick this off. A lot of questions, but I'll leave the questions till all three of our speakers have spoken. Yuen, if you can kind of talk to us about the political impacts of the coronavirus, the effects on the bilateral relationship, and the effects on the kind of political system in China. There's a lot of debate about whether this is a strengthening or a destabilizing event in China. So you could comment on that. That'd be great. Turn it over to you. Thanks.
Oh, first of all, Steve, thank you very much to the National Committee for hosting this platform for constructive dialogue. And it's a real pleasure to be on this panel with Elizabeth and Amy. I will take off from where Amy ended. She mentioned the first phase of the U.S. China trade deal on January 15 this year, which was the day the phase 1 deal was signed. I was at an event hosted by the Asia Society on U.S. China relations. And on that panel, they asked me to comment on what I think the future of U.S. China relations was going to be like. And my projection at the time was pessimistic. I expected that the relations will get worse. My reasoning at the time was that Washington's increasing hostility towards China is validating long-held suspicions in China that America will not tolerate its rise. Unfortunately, my pessimism came true, though like everyone else, I could not have foreseen the catalyst of this worsening relationship, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, when we were at the event, I remember no one talked about the virus. And it's really shocking that just within 3 months, the whole world has turned upside down. So I wanted to touch on the question of why has U.S.-China relations deteriorated at a time when global cooperation is most urgently needed. And as a political scientist, I think I would underscore the factor of deep political insecurity on the part of leaders in both countries. And to explain that, let me begin with China. So President Xi Jinping may now appear triumphant for having won the battle against the virus. But I am not so sure that he's really as triumphant as many people believe him to be. In fact, I think he has good reasons to be worried. To explain why, let me step back and provide some context, which I recently wrote about in an article in Nature, the science magazine, and it's called When COVID-19 Meets Centralized Personalized Power. It's useful for us to understand, firstly, that China under Xi is very different from China in the previous decades. Xi represents a period of authoritarian revival. He has clamped down on political freedoms, and he has centralized power in his own hands. This has been well documented by Liz Economy and other experts. Graham Allison describes Xi as the chairman of everything. Well, absolute power brings absolute responsibility. So there's a price for centralizing power. If you look at my analysis in Nature, you'll see that the decision-making process and the chain of command during COVID is more centralized than during SARS, which was a period of collective leadership and decentralization. This implies that Xi himself bears heavy personal responsibility for any of his decisions, including his errors. And this is reflected both in his initial indecision and indirectly in his creation of a stifling political environment, which suppressed whistleblowers and freedom of speech. So once we understand this deep insecurity and the heavy personal responsibility that he has to bear in an extremely centralized environment, I think we can better understand why his regime has reacted or interacted with the US in a very defensive and even aggressive way. We have seen China do an all-out campaign to celebrate what China has done right under Xi, without any mention of what China has failed to do and in what ways it has failed. In all fairness, I'm sure that Xi himself does not want a crisis. Perhaps the party will have a moment of introspection and reflect on what went wrong. And I think that he must also see and understand the imperative for cooperation and reconciliation. At the same time, as a political scientist, I'll say that we must also recognize his domestic political imperative, which is to rewrite narrative in his favor and to rally the nation behind him with America on the other side. Thus, for now, it is difficult for me to see the motivation for reconciliation to come unless Xi regains his sense of political security. Then moving on the US side, the story is quite straightforward. I think most of us can agree that the Trump administration had completely failed to prepare for the outbreak, even though they had known about it and saw it exploding in China for months. This undermines Trump's bid for re-election in November. But the response is simple, which is to put all the blame on China. This is obviously simplistic, but simplistic sells. Simplistic is a very appealing message. So on the US side, the political motivations for reconciliation are just as weak, in my view. So when you put the two sides together, I could not feel optimistic about the direction of US-China relations going forward, at least not in 2020. The coming presidential election in November will obviously be a game changer, and we'll have to see whether and how the political landscape shakes up by then. Having sort of laid out a rather pessimistic outlook, I wanted, however, to end on two promising points. First, I wish to highlight that while leaders in both countries have failed in their own ways, one in transparency and the other in competence, civil society in both China and the US have really stepped up. NGOs, volunteers, the private sector, organizations like the National Committee, and I think Elizabeth will enlighten us more on that. So I think it's very, very important for us to keep in mind going forward, not to confuse societies with the leadership. And when we say China, we need to be precise about who we mean by China. Do we mean President Xi, the party, the government, or the society, right? Because if we fail to unbundle these parties, then I think we risk unnecessarily antagonizing the whole nation of China, when a lot of the conflict is actually between the leadership. And likewise, when the Chinese people talk about America, I would urge that they should know that the American society is not the same as the American government. The second promising point I would highlight is that both of the top leaders, President Xi and President Trump, still, of course, have a great deal of power in their hands. So if they are willing to call a truce and say, we'll set aside our domestic imperatives and pledge to cooperate for the time being until the crisis passes, there is still tremendous room for them to do that. And indeed, we have seen that after a phone call, the escalation, of war of words sort of was put on pause for the time being. So we hope that both society will continue to step up, and the two leaders, despite their domestic political constraints, will be willing for the moment to put aside their own interests and put the national interests before them. Thank you.
Yuen, thank you. Very, very wise words, especially I love the people always talk about China as if it's this monolith, when there is, Xi, there is the standing committee, the Politburo, the party, the people, the civil administration, and you really need to make that distinction. Elizabeth, Yuen set it up perfectly for you by saying the role of civil society is one of the few, well, I think Amy Yearly talked about a few bright spots in the economic relationship, but let's talk about the civil society what it's been doing in this case, where it stands, and what it can do going forward.
Okay, so thank you, Steve, and to the National Committee for hosting this platform. It's really wonderful, and I think we reach more people in this platform than we would in a conference room. So this is really wonderful, and very honored to meet Yuen and be on a panel with her and to see Amy. So really want to thank everybody for this opportunity. And so I sort of framed in preparation, I sort of thought about my remarks a little bit differently. So I'll start there, but also really want to link into, if I can, the previous two speakers, because I think civil society exists in an ecosystem that is economic and political, and it also informs the ecosystem that is both economic and political. So it is a very symbiotic relationship among the three parts of any given society and community. And I think civil society is one of those words that we throw around, and yet we need to maybe define what it is. And so I want to try to clarify how I want to sort of frame my remarks, but I'm happy to speak more broadly in the Q&A. So I think on the one hand, civil society is extremely diverse, right? It's filled with all manner of organizations in any society that are not government and they're not business. And so that's everything from academic institutions, religious institutions, civic engagement institutions, trade associations, a plethora of organizations that are not the same as each other and yet are comprised this civil society. So I just think it's important to, number one, when we talk about civil society and its role in U.S. China relations, I do think that we need to be a little bit clear that it's a diverse and a robustly diverse set of institutions that have unique roles to play. And I would say also, so some of those roles include things like knowledge generation and dissemination, facilitation of dialogue and communication, advocacy, service delivery, funding, like the Ford Foundation is also part of civil society. So creating all of that. So number one, my point is that whether it's in China, which is also has an increasingly diverse and robust civil society, or in the United States, we're talking about a complex set of institutions. The other kind of way to think about this, and I will talk mostly about what I see as the role that American civil society can play in the United States right now in this moment of U.S.-China relations. But there are other ways to look at this, which we can get into later, which are how are American civil society organizations working internationally or bilaterally with China? How are Chinese civil society organizations working now, as Yuen alluded to, quite robustly inside China in reaction to the moment of COVID-19 that's possibly opening up some space for them, although we can talk about how big that space really will be. And can American and Chinese NGOs work internationally in Africa, in Latin America, in relation to the COVID-19 outbreak? Those are all kind of different ways of thinking about civil society. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking again about the role of American civil society in this moment of sort of U.S.-China relations being in such a negative place and having this crisis-driven opportunity brought to us by COVID-19. I would say that civil society, its role is most effective when we can identify a way in which the parties involved, in this case the United States and China, either have a shared objective or outcome or have parallel interests that are equally served by increased dialogue and communication that can be facilitated by civil society. So when we can identify those areas of, if not alignment, certainly parallel interests, where both parties are served by having better communication and dialogue, more exchange, more communication, then there's sort of a ripe atmosphere for civil society to be its most effective. And when we're in a moment like we are now, where it's more difficult to identify where there's that sort of commonality of desired outcomes, then it's a little bit more difficult to see where civil society can play its most important role. And so I think that's just an important point to make about this moment, that I think it's a little bit less clear where we can find our common ground. And then another point I want to make is that when I think about civil society, and I've worked at the National Committee and Ford, and I've worked in with a lot of civil society organizations, I think that civil society can play a catalytic role, and civil society can play sort of a steady state kind of role. And when I think about, I often now reflect back to the founding of the National Committee and that period of time in the 1960s and the 1970s, where there was a deep misunderstanding between the United States and China, mistrust between the two countries, but both countries felt it was in their interests, even if those interests weren't totally aligned, it was in their individual interests to increase their dialogue and discussion and their approach to one another. And in that moment, organizations like the National Committee, like the U.S. China Business Council, like the Committee for Scholarly Communication with the PRC, played very, very catalytic roles in leading the way to kind of open the space so that governments could follow and businesses could follow behind into sort of this era of creating dialogue and understanding between China and the United States. And foundations like the Ford Foundation were enablers of those institutions to do what they were going to do. So there was the catalytic role at a moment of that looked bleak and dark, and yet there was an opportunity to be really creative and very forward thinking and to take a chance on something that didn't look like it had a lot of a chance. And after that, in the decades that followed, civil society's engagement with China and the American civil society engagement grew and became more diverse and really became more of a steady state fabric in the relationship. So there is a role for civil society in maintaining, as I think both my panelist colleagues said, a channel of communication, a platform for dialogue, human to human, people to people kind of engagement that transcends and is different from the way our governments interact. And so here I see civil society is a catalytic role, but also sort of a steady state fabric of the relationship kind of role. And so the question that I think we have today, even prior to COVID-19, is what is the role of American civil society today in this moment of difficult U.S.-China relations? And is there an opportunity now created by the crisis of COVID-19 to sort of take this moment to push something forward? And I would say, I think that there are some reasons why what happened in the 1960s and the 1970s is more difficult now. And I think there are some things that we can be hopeful about. So why I think it's a little bit more difficult is now, in the 2020s, the United States and China believe that they know each other sufficiently. We've had many decades of engagement, and now we feel and we think that we know each other very well, and we think we don't always like everything that we see. So in the 60s and the 70s, there wasn't anything, we didn't know anything, and so anything that we learned was valuable and important. Today, I think a lot of people feel like we know what we need to know and we don't need to know anything more. And what we do know is not making us feel very comfortable with one another. So I think that makes it much the sort of mutual understanding, the kind of goals from the earlier decades are much more elusive if everybody feels like they already know everything that they need to know. And I think that obviously the relationship is far more complex. We're on this phone call because it is economic, it's political, it's social. It's a much more complex relationship, and inside that relationship, there's many, many interests that are both playing out domestically, as Yuen just mentioned, and then bilaterally. So it's a much more complicated field to navigate for anybody, including civil society. And so I think we also know very well that civil society broadly in the world is constrained globally in many, many places. And in particular, there are constraints on international civil society operating in China. And there are interesting constraints and openings for civil society inside of China, but we all know that civil society in China is very small compared to the government and likely always will be. And so it's really kind of hard to see sometimes the role that civil society can play right now in this moment in U.S. China relations. And I think about it a lot, obviously, from my position at Ford. But I do think there's some reasons why we can be hopeful. And I do think that some of the characteristics of civil society are important to keep in mind. On the one hand, civil society tends to be more flexible than many governments or businesses. They're able to absorb new knowledge and information. They can pivot. They can work at the intersections of issues, at the intersections of actors. So there is a way in which civil society can kind of be the water that flows through all of the other sort of more fixed rocks in the stream and see if we can erode our way towards some path of better relations in the future. I also think that many NGOs, particularly foundations, and here I speak mostly about sort of funders and larger NGOs, have a risk capacity, right? That can take a risk, that can try to anticipate, take a bet, a big bet on some kind of opportunity and give it some resources just to see if it has some traction. So I do think civil society has flexibility and it has a risk-taking element to it. And I think there is a resiliency in civil society because it is so diverse. If one part of civil society is struggling, there may be another part that can rise to an occasion. So if public interest lawyers are having a hard time engaging with China, it might be that medical care professionals have an opportunity, or however that works. So there's a resilience in the diversity of civil society. And so I think that these give me hope that at this moment, while it's not our 1960s moment, it is I think an inflection point in U.S. China relations that has the opportunity in it for civil society to play a catalytic role, to get out of its sort of steady state, let's maintain the fabric role, and move into a let's take a risk, let's try to imagine a different future, let's look around the curve and try to see what's coming and take a bet on that and lead the way I think civil society did in the 60s and in the 70s to a different future, despite the significant challenges that exist at this moment. And on COVID, I think maybe we can discuss this in the Q&A. I mean, I'm not sure COVID is going to change our world in quite the way that we are all speculating that it might. And I'm not sure that it's a moment that will really fundamentally change the political and economic challenges in the U.S.-China relationship. But it might be a hook we can sort of hang some of our expectations on and see if we can move forward. But I'd be happy to talk further about that. And I'm really interested in Amy and Yuen and Steve's point of view on that question. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
All right, Elizabeth, thank you so much. Glad to see everyone ends on some notes of optimism in these fairly dark days. But let me start with a dark question. It is clear, historically, the party in power in the United States has been portrayed by the party out of power in an election as the pro-China party, that they've been soft on China. Whether the Republicans were in office, the Democrats attacked them as being pro-China. Then when Clinton went against HW, he was supporting the butchers of Beijing. That is clearly not going to be the case in this election. That seeing the initial Republican ads, I think, Yuen, you hit the nail on the head, where the strategy is going to be to blame China and to try and deflect the attention, the administration, the party in power, deflect attention from their own failings and blame China. So my question, which means from now through November, it's going to be whacking China every day, both in free media and in paid media. So what do you think for each of your fields? What is that going to do, Yuen, to the political relationship? Amy, what's it going to do to the economic relationship? And Elizabeth, are kind of the civil society organizations going to be able to operate in this incredibly dark environment? Yuen, start with you.
Well, Steve, I think you've put the problem as starkly as possible. And that is why I want to be optimistic, but it's hard to find a reason to be optimistic because the winning strategy is so clear, which is to blame China, deflect attention from failings. And bear in mind that even before COVID, there was already a lot of blaming of China for other problems like the loss of jobs, loss of manufacturing and inequality and so forth. And so we should all be worried about this blame game. Not only because it harms U.S. China relations, but because fundamentally it prevents America from fixing its own problems. It prevents America from reinventing itself in the ways necessary to make itself more competitive. And there's a deeper problem on the Chinese side. The whacking of China is in a way really good for the autocratic camp in the regime. That's music to their ears because it helps to stoke nationalism. It makes Chinese citizens feel that if I love my country, I have to stand behind my government and my party because look at how, the US is whacking China every day. And so that kind of blame game is destructive of multiple elements, which then opens the question of what can be done. I think we are trying to do our best here by having this conversation. It is the best possible step that we can take. Constructive, open dialogue, getting people to think beyond, these easy slogans of blaming China. And the more informed people there are out there, the less likely that these kind of blame games will work. So we have to take it one step at a time. It has to be bottom up because we cannot count on leaders if you just look at their political interests to do the right things. So we have to do what we can, which is to educate, to teach, and at least be informed.
Amy, what's it going to do to the economic relationship?
Well, I completely agree with Yuen that this blame game is incredibly damaging to the economic relationship, to the prospects of finding our way out of this current crisis with COVID-19. I don't think it's going to wholly change, but let me try to be a little bit optimistic on the economic side, only because I think in the United States, the Democratic Party now has a set of policies that the Trump administration has tried to use in order to change the nature of competition with China. And the Democratic Party is going to judge that. I don't think China will escape blame for many elements, and I think COVID-19 is going to be a very challenging issue in the United States for us to get past in order to, again, talk about what do we need to do from here to benefit from an economic relationship with China. But I do think that the last 3.5 years has offered a different model for the economic relationship, this use of unilateralism and tariffs and really this national security overlay so much of economic policymaking. Now, I will be very quick to say it took laws to be changed in order to put these policies in place, and those laws had bipartisan support. So I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish here and say the Democrats are going to change everything contentious in the economic relationship that the Trump administration has put into place. However, there have been real consequences of a lot of these policies. And one of the consequences is almost 2 years into a trade war, we really don't have many results to see. Again, rhetorically, we can say that the Phase 1 trade agreement was a success, but when you dive down into exactly what did we achieve, it is very little, and the agreement is quite incomplete. Now, I completely agree in this political season, demonizing China is going to be the easier way forward to oppose President Trump as the Democratic Party seeking to have him voted out of office. However, I do think when we're talking about economic policy making, we have seen a lot of the liabilities of the Trump administration's economic policies, and so rationale to change, to use multilateral fora to actually try to pressure China to change some of the economic behaviors that have cost the US economy and the global economy considerably. And so I don't want to minimize some of the challenges that the Trump administration has been trying to address. I will say the Democratic Party can put in stark contrast, rather than taking XYZ steps forward that the Trump administration took, we are going to try to put in place a more sophisticated set of policies in order to try to achieve the same things, which is a more balanced economic relationship. Absolutely not easy. And this concept of deep competition and rivalry between the US and China on the economic front is going to be a characterization of the relationship for the foreseeable future. So I also agree with Elizabeth that COVID-19 in some ways could be a hook for some areas where maybe not on fighting the pandemic, but getting the global economy restarted. The United States and China can work together and maybe minimize some of the demonization of China and focus on the way forward.
Before going to Elizabeth, any chance for phase 2 of the trade agreement?
I think
in the post-COVID world?
I think in 2020, there's zero chance for a phase 2 trade agreement. And I hate to say it, but I had that view prior to COVID-19 as well. I think because of the political climate here in the United States, it was going to be very challenging to focus on phase 2. And of course, in Beijing, there's very little interest in dealing with tackling the very, very challenging issues that have been left for the phase 2 trade agreements. I do think, of course, we have to come back to them. We absolutely will need to, but I think COVID-19 gives a buffer before we're going to get there.
Elizabeth, does it get so dark that civil society have difficulty operating in China, which it already does, and even in the United States as a result of investigations by government?
So I'll try to have a few comments here. So I think before I answer that specific question, I think one really big impact of COVID-19 on civil society is just whether or not organizations are going to survive, right? Because now markets are falling, foundation endowments are shrinking, corporate budgets for their philanthropic giving and are shrinking, right? And so a lot of, certainly for foundation grantees, are facing real serious economic challenges to just their very survival, regardless of what it is that they work on. So one kind of impact of COVID on civil society that isn't political in any way is just simply the ecosystem that supports civil society, I think in both countries, because China's economy is also not going to be as robust, is really throwing into question the survivability of a lot of civil society NGOs. Chinese foundations themselves have already really significantly reduced the kinds of work that they do, and this was before COVID and before the impact on the economy. Just the overall slowing of the Chinese economy has already started to have an impact on the way Chinese foundations are able to support civil society kinds of practices inside China. So that's sort of one thing that's regardless of the political climate. I think that, you know, as I mentioned, a lot of civil society sometimes can play under the radar, behind the scenes, sort of in the intersections between issues. And I think that that really does still continue to happen. And the National Committee is an excellent example, but it's not the only one. And within China, the same way. Just grantees of the Ford Foundation, partners of the Ford Foundation, who are committed to a more nuanced understanding of the United States inside China and vice versa Americans who are committed to that more nuanced understanding are still here, still doing what we're doing, having discussions like this and trying to innovate and think of ways to keep the dialogue going and to keep that constructive and nuanced, not so politicized narrative about the U.S. China relationship alive and in the minds of most people. And I think there really is an opportunity for that. So if the organizations can remain funded and remain robust and remain able to survive, then I think that a lot of them are still able to pursue their missions, even though the broader political narrative and discourse is increasingly negative. I'm not saying that it's easy, it's far more difficult. I started working at Ford in China 7 years ago, and the difference between, the ease of what we did then compared to what we do now it's quite dramatic, dramatically less easy. And I would also just say that I'm also trying to think about the U.S.-China relationship in a broader context, which is sort of a multilateral context. So thinking about China's actions in the global South, the way its small number of civil society organizations are working in countries in Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America, and where the U.S. meets China elsewhere, I think is also, I hope, is a opportunity to sort of see where we might find things that we would do together around development outcomes in other countries that might, again, present an opportunity. And whether that's a pandemic, response or it's some other developmental goal, I don't think that matters as much as whether we can find the opportunity to do it together.
Interesting. Yuen, you said that China's president is insecure. There's an enormous amount of discussion in the China community today with very kind of starkly different views, with some arguing, Huang Yinzheng arguing that this has been, the dealing with COVID has been an enormous success for Xi and has strengthened his power, not only within China, but globally. Or the other end of the spectrum would be Min Xinpei, who argues that the Chinese Communist Party is closer to collapsing today than it has ever been since 1949. Where do you come out on that issue, and what ultimately does it mean for U.S.-China relations? And Amy and Elizabeth should be free to chime in on this also.
That is a great question. It's a very difficult question. My take on this is that we are hearing contradictory views about the political stability in China. And these contradictory views are actually both correct. And that's how I understand it. It means that on the one hand, there are certain aspects of Xi's role where he has succeeded in turning the narrative around. Sequence and timing was on his side. But on the other hand, almost every day you hear all kinds of rumors coming out of China or signs that his power is being challenged. One recent example was an open letter challenging Xi written by the tycoon Ren Zhiqiang, and he has now been arrested. And many other incidents, like the propaganda department put out a tome to celebrate Xi, and it was titled, "The Great Nation's Fight Against the Virus." And just within weeks, it was taken off the shelves because it was widely mocked on the internet. So the way we should understand these contradictory news is that Chinese politics has actually profoundly changed, even though Xi remains in office. It has profoundly changed in the sense that it has entered a zone of deep uncertainty, where the possibility of Xi remaining in office for life and the possibility of him being ousted tomorrow are both equally thinkable. And this is actually a big break from Chinese politics before Xi, because if you recall the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao era, that by comparison was the boring period of Chinese politics, right? Where we hear problems, but on the whole, we can expect that when time is up, there will be a peaceful, regular handover of power. We don't reasonably expect extreme, unthinkable outcome to happen. But if you think about what's different in Chinese politics today is the deep uncertainty. That it could be any of these two extreme outcomes. And so this, I think, would have ramifications for not only how the country is run, but also for the economy. Because one of the premises for China's continued economic growth is political certainty, political stability. Some kind of stable expectations that politics would be stable, there would be a non-violent regular turnover of power, and so forth. But you now cannot have these clear expectations of what is going to happen tomorrow, the next week, or the next month. So that's how I would understand the political changes that have actually already happened in China.
Amy, Elizabeth, you want to add to that answer?
So I'll say something. I don't actually know whether Xi Jinping is going to leave tomorrow or stay for life. And I think that's an interesting thing that we can debate. But what I do think is that the institutions of Chinese political power, of the state, of the party are strong, regardless of whether he leaves tomorrow or if he leaves at the end of his life. And I think it's really important as Americans, and when we're thinking about this moment of rivalry or deep competition or whatever we want to describe the moment that we're in, we can't dream that somehow the Chinese regime or political system is going to fundamentally disappear or change, right? And we have to think about our own interests and our own approaches to China from the point of view of assuming that it will be there and it will be strong. And I've also been thinking about, there's a short-term hit for all of us in this COVID pandemic, economically, politically, socially, and we don't know how hard that is going to hit us. But if we look out 5 years from now, my guess is that China's outward projection of its economic and political power will, even if it takes a setback now on the Belt and Road, and there's a lot of discussion about what will happen in the next short term, I would say that in the medium term, China will be a formidable economic and political power in the world, and regardless of who's leading the party or the government. And we as Americans, we need to start to think about how to prepare ourselves and invest in ourselves and understand that reality and accept it, and then figure out how we're going to deal with it, and not really imagine a day when the Communist Party is going to fall apart.
I agree, Elizabeth, but I think the COVID origins were a failure of governance. That the COVID origins were a failure of governance, that the Chinese CDC had in place reporting mechanisms, which the party in Hubei, it appears, again, I haven't seen enough documentation, but it appears overruled the civil side of the government. That the party, as it often does, exerted its power to do something which government wasn't supposed to be doing. Will that lead to some changes in Chinese governance? The party is great at studying its mistakes and then fixing them.
So yeah, I hope so. And we certainly see, the same way we see civil society stepping up, I certainly see a little bit of a opening up for sort of academic policy-oriented discussion around governance and transparency, which was robust prior to Xi Jinping era, and is now, we're wondering how much and how far this discussion can go. But even that discussion is not aimed at fundamentally, it's aimed at making the existing system work better. From a governance and transparency point of view. Not so much, I don't think, at fundamentally changing the system. So that's, I think, the difference. So I do think that there is a moment of potential reflection around governance issues in China and about transparency and about how you kind of get that to work from the top of the system to the bottom. And I'm very hopeful that there will be a more robust discourse on that in China. But I also don't think that means that the fundamental structure is going to disappear or change.
Amy.
I would just add to the conversation that not only do we not know if Xi Jinping is going to be in power 7 years from now or 20 years from now, we don't know even in the shorter term exactly how China is going to continue to drive economic development at home and overseas. And so that's another piece of uncertainty that very much like Yuen and Elizabeth have said, should lead the United States to look inward and think about how we are going to compete on the global stage of ideas, political systems, and our economy by making sure we revitalize ourselves and focus on our competitiveness regardless of how China is going to be run politically, as well as the economic model that it's going to follow. I think now is the time that we do have to be thinking in those terms, not trying to read tea leaves, political or economic, but what can we control and do better?
I have lots of other questions, but I've now exceeded my time in asking questions. So let me go to the audience questions. Levy asked, no additional description, which follows on perfectly to our last question. What is your opinion of the Washington Post's article that appeared today saying the coronavirus outbreak may have been a result of the low quality security at the Wuhan virology lab? Anybody want to take that question?
I didn't read the article. I read a headline and I read a bunch of commentary about it. So I think, I guess my personal point of view now would be to, rather than always looking back at this, like where did it start and whose fault is it, to try to think about how we are going to address the existing global crisis. And is there a way to do that together and collectively or just on our own? And, you know, what can we put in place so that the next time something like this happens, that we are better prepared as a globe and as a country? And because I think we're never maybe really gonna know exactly how this thing started, and maybe that is less important than figuring out how we work together to address it.
I must take this one. It's from Ken Lieberthal, who's a director of the committee and former senior director for Asia at the National Security Council. Is there a politically feasible path in China and in the United States for the two to cooperate to mobilize and lead a globally coordinated effort to bring the pandemic under control?
I'll kick off and say, well, we've already lost a number of opportunities to do that. And so I'm more than a little bit, I'm quite pessimistic that the US and China together are going to lead. I do think that it's going to require a multilateral forum, and I think that's implicit in your question, Ken. But I think given just this raging deficit of trust between the two countries that the COVID outbreak really has uncovered, it's going to make it very difficult for us to act as quickly as we need to be doing on bringing the pandemic in control in the rest of the world where it is still unfolding. However, I'm less pessimistic about the ability of the United States and China to be part of an international coalition dealing with the economic ramifications of the outbreak. And so, you know, again, I'm pessimistic about the short-term political will in Washington, D.C. and in Beijing for the United States and China to be seen as leaders in controlling this outbreak. but I do think we have to be seen as leaders among others in dealing with the economic ramifications of that. And I think there are opportunities for that down the road.
This one's from Richard Kagan from Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. How COVID-19 may affect China and the U.S. relations with Taiwan? Yuen, you want to take that? Is that up your alley?
Sure. I think that is a political question. And so Taiwan has, I think, emerged positively in terms of its image from COVID-19. And it has helped its global standing. It will draw Taiwan closer to the US. And Taiwan now also serves to show that you can have a democracy and still do well in mitigating the epidemic. This, I think, will likely put Beijing at some unease, both on the level of closer US relations with Taiwan, as well as the fact that you have this community and it is a democracy, and yet it's able to do well in mitigating the pandemic, which undermines the favored narrative that a top-down authoritarian system is what it takes to put this under control.
From Joyce Zhang, is there a third party or intermediary that has a viable chance of facilitating relations between the US and China? You know, should we have a Kissinger trip to Pakistan?
I'm not sure I see much evidence of that, but I might not be looking in the right places. So yeah, I don't.
I'm having a hard time too, Elizabeth. I was thinking, you know, can the European Union, is Brussels a possibility, is Tokyo? And I think both wouldn't be seen as objective players in that. And obviously I could add Moscow in there as well, and no. So I think this is a tough one, Steve. I think on issues, absolutely. I think APEC, the WTO, the G20 could be opportunities to help bridge some of the gaping challenges that the US and China are having, dealing bilaterally with one another. I can't see another country playing that role as easily.
This one for you, mostly, Amy, but Yuen and Elizabeth certainly can add to the answer, is the COVID has sped up decoupling. That when Americans couldn't get masks because they were manufactured in China, or pharma, you know, there were threats, not from the government, but from nationalists in China to cut off supply of ingredients to medicines in the United States. Clearly, there's an easy argument to make. The only way we can deal with that is decouple. We have to have that production in the United States, and you can make that argument on a compelling national security basis. So has COVID sped up decoupling? That was what was going to occur in 7 to 10 years is going to occur really in 12 months.
I do agree that the challenge of global supply chains is being absolutely highlighted. And now, you know, we were talking about technology competition between the United States and China for so long as one reason why we need to decouple. And now we could move that into the realm of concern over access to medical supplies and pharmaceuticals. But I think, Steve, really, rather than blaming China or interdependence with China, I think this is a challenge of globalization. And so rather than making U.S. China the problem here, I do think we have to acknowledge that just-in-time production and global supply chains are in place because they're economically beneficial for the companies who are developing them and are trying to be as nimble as possible in providing products around the world. If we were to onshore a lot sustainable, it's that globalization has really created problems that we need to deal with. And so yes, rather than calling it decoupling, I would say COVID-19 is certainly going to accelerate diversification of global supply chains. But I don't think this is an area where we should blame U.S.-China interdependence. This is a bigger issue.
And I'll just underscore that, 100% agree with what Amy said. And I think COVID has really, revealed a lot of the challenges that globalization has created, not just economic ones, but social ones and inequalities. And you look at the United States, and I think even in China, if we could see it closely and clearly, a neoliberal economic development model, a market-driven economic development model has left people behind. And they have been left behind around the whole world. And so I do think that COVID is kind of borderless curtain being pulled back on some of the challenges that have come along with globalization that I do hope that all countries will start to address, particularly our own, but all.
This is from Kimberly Mullen. Hi, Kim. Would you speak more to possible effects of COVID-19 on China's Belt and Road Initiative around the world? Also, thank you for this compelling discussion and making us on this online forum, so many of us to be included on this online forum. Who wants to take BRI question?
Well, I'm happy to talk about BRI. It's almost surreal to bring in BRI at this point, because it was at a point this ambitious $1 trillion initiative, and now in the midst of the pandemic, almost no one talks about it anymore. It's very unclear going forward whether China will continue with BRI, with its global expansion. The commitments that have already made, the loans that have already been made out, those will have to be dealt with. They cannot be canceled. But then there is this question of, are they going to continue to do more projects? And given the economic downturn, as well as the geopolitical tensions that China has, not only with the US, but with many other countries around the world, I think it's now really up in the air as to what is going to happen to BRI. I think at this point, the number one problem on the table is how should China revive its own economy? I think that's their number one imperative. And this is very hard to do unless the US economy is revived, because these two economies are so interdependent that even if Chinese factories reopen, you will need to have orders from the North American market in order to revive the Chinese domestic economy.
And I would just say I totally agree. And I think, and maybe this is because I'm a NGO trying to look around the curve and see what's coming. I do think that China's 5 years from now, will the Belt and Road be as big as it's imagined to be now? And the Belt and Road, really, these investments existed before it was even called the Belt and Road. So some form of projection of economic and political power by China out into the world will continue. Maybe it will be sort of called up short for a few years while China recovers and by the global economy recovers. But I do think that China will continue to be an actor on the world stage in a way that is bigger than most other actors, and therefore an actor that we're going to have to deal with in its own political and economic power.
This is, let's talk about students, and there's a good question to kick it off from Michelle Scott. I'm the dean of by the way, we have callers from people asking questions from the UK, Tokyo, and China. So we are covering all the time zones. I'm the dean of a cooperative institute between a U.S. university and a Chinese university located in Changchun. Economically, there is already a huge negative impact on schools, especially business schools, due to COVID-19. China exports more students than any other country, and many students attend school in the U.S. What do you think is going to happen about Chinese students? What is the economic impact? And what if most don't come back? We saw charter flights returning students from Europe and the United States to China. What happens if they don't come back? What does it mean economically and politically and socially? Elizabeth?
If the Chinese students don't come back to the United States?
Yes.
Well, I mean, they're a very important economic factor at most of the universities where they are, right? So that's an economic hit for universities. They spend money, they're consumers, so it is an economic hit to the United States. I think maybe more importantly that without sort of the younger people in each other's country sort of learning about each other and about each country, that really also from a civic engagement and a civil society engagement and the sort of fabric of the relationship point of view is a really negative. And we would hope that this wouldn't, that there wouldn't be decoupling among, from at a university or a school level, because I do think that those kinds of experiences and those kinds of relationships that are built are really an essential part of the fabric. So it's an economic hit, but I also think a longer term problem would be if there were just fewer and fewer people who were exposed and learning about each other through their own lived experience. And I think that would be probably a longer term negative in the relationship than the economic hit.
I'm on the board of my private high school in Connecticut, where I first studied about China in the mid-1980s. And now, fast forward a few years, 10% of the student body is Chinese. And so we've been dealing with this issue of what to do next year. Will there be an impact on recruitment? And to date, I'm sharing this just to be positive. There hasn't been a negative impact on recruitment of Chinese high school students to a very small school in Connecticut. And I take that to mean that there still is a market for what Elizabeth is talking about, trying to build these bridges and learn about the world outside of where you are, whether you're an American wanting to study in China like your program, or like my high school Chinese students coming to the United States. So I hope my one tiny sample is true in other contexts, because like Elizabeth said, it's a massive hit on the US economy if we lose the hundreds of thousands of students who are here in the United States.
Here's one from Doug Paul, who's director of the committee at Carnegie. Government coordination looks unavailing. Should we encourage private people with credibility on the issues, such as Bill Gates, to reach out on common objectives, such as vaccine development? So kind of put on your thinking caps and think about prominent Americans who should be out there talking about the U.S.-China relationship.
I personally think so. I think that anybody who has a vested interest in sort of the cooperation to solve global problems, whether it's a pandemic or environmental degradation, climate change, all those kinds of issues, if there are people who can speak with influence and credibility, I would welcome them to do so. And that's another kind of part of the diversity of civil society, that you can have people like Bill Gates, and then you can have grassroots NGOs, and they can be working kind of towards the same outcome from different perspectives in the ecosystem. And I think that that is wholly positive.
And
Yuen, did you want to add something?
Yeah, to build on that, in addition to Bill Gates, I think in this day and age, we could also consider the role of social influencers, because we live in a different time. This is the age of the social media, and some of the most influential social influencers in China and in the US have tens of millions of followers. You see, for example, some of the YouTubers who are foreigners who live in China, who have actually played a very positive role in helping to explain China back to their communities at home in a way that regular people can relate to, because they don't feel that, oh, this is a message, you know, coming from someone who is an elite and very far away from my life. Rather, this is someone, you know, who is like my next door neighbor, and I could completely relate to this person. I think that it is a force that has been neglected and possibly completely untapped, but it is there. So if we really do want to look into alternative sources of linking U.S.-China relations, we should look on the social front.
Yeah, and I loved your kind of call to, even when it's dark, educate, educate, educate. That the you know, and Elizabeth and Amy, it was, you know, we need to, whatever is going on, to educate. Do you think, obviously you're as a political scientist, do you think the American people are aware of the consequences of this conflict between the United States and China? That, I mean, I was probably the single most stunning statistic, which, you know, I'm supposed to know all about this. I didn't know that CDC had reduced its presence in China in 2017 from, I will get the numbers roughly, but it was about 41 people, including 11 Americans and 30 kind of Chinese who were working for CDC, down to 11, 3 Americans, 8 Chinese, and the epidemiologist who was there, her position was eliminated. So she came back to the United States too. So you can't tell if having all those people there would have given us better early warning, but probably you can assume it would have. We would have understood much more. But do you think the American people understand that when we follow these policies, there are consequences for our daily life?
Well, that is a very important question, and that is where we do need public opinion surveys to get at exactly what people think and understand. But I wanted to address your question by drawing, say, on my own experience as a teacher at the University of Michigan. And I think it's worthwhile to throw out the idea that that a liberal arts education today should include giving people basic literacy on China's rise and U.S.-China relations, because these are the two things that are the most consequential for the 21st century. But they're not part of the basic education that we provide even to college students. So if you look at the typical college campus, apart from the small number who self-select to learn about these topics, even educated college students may know, like as you've described, next to nothing about these topics, or worse, building on Elizabeth's earlier point, they actively misunderstand it. Because of this age of internet and social media and abundance of information, it gives people this false impression that they know the issues. And so instead of seeking out facts and perspectives, they believe in their false impression. So I do think that there is a big gap in providing this knowledge as a form of basic literacy in the 21st century. A second point I'll raise is that even in my classroom, teaching about U.S. China relations is extremely challenging because we are in such a politically charged environment. And one of the things I find is that because of this polarization and politicization, it's difficult to be a moderate, whether you are a teacher or a commentator or even as an academic. Because when you are a moderate, the ones on the extremes will accuse you of being too soft on China. Like anything that is less than the most extreme stance is regarded as being soft or even being critical of the United States. And so we need more than ever moderate, balanced perspectives at both sides of the story. And we need to allow people to be moderates. Because if you don't have this moderate class of people, then you're gonna have you're gonna have the extremes pull us on either sides. And that is very disruptive and potentially dangerous.
I guess on that point, I really do agree with Yuen, and I'll come back to what Elizabeth said before. You know, can we use COVID-19 somehow as a hook here to change narratives? I think you know, the rise of China is seen as such a threatening thing for many Americans. I think, as Yuen said, some of that is because of ignorance, and some of that is just polarization of the narrative itself. But when we try to think about how are we going to pull the global economy and our individual economies out of the recession, the significant recession we're about to face because of a global health pandemic on our own, it does come back to the need to have the channels for talking about response, and then the ability to work together to actually implement policies that will help our individual countries and the global economy. And so again, not just the role of China in the world as a new and different phenomenon that some people are seeing as a negative thing, but the role of all of us leading economies to have to work together to overcome this global crisis. In some ways, we just have to lean into that narrative, that it is not about China's rise. It is about we together need to overcome an issue right now that is going to define much of the future of many of us on this call.
Last question, I don't have it in front of me, but Erica was of our own office, the National Committee office, was asking about how anti-Asian sentiment in the United States is playing into this, you know, U.S. China relations and the COVID crisis. And what should we do about it? Yuen, since you're the Asian on this panel?
I'm not sure if I could represent all of the Asians. This is such a difficult question. I think I will say that one of the great difficulties of talking about U.S.-China relations in a rational way is that it almost inevitably gets mixed up with racism. And we see it with the whole COVID-19. For example, when President Trump called it the Chinese virus, right? That created a whole uproar, and many have linked that to an increased number of racist attacks on Asians. What can we do? And I think I would have to go kind of back to my fundamental point, which is that the long-term solution to these kinds of problems is still education. We need, at the most basic level, just to teach people to understand that China is not the same as the Chinese people. We need to really get that into head. Yes, the Chinese government may have failed in the initial stages of the outbreak, failed in being transparent, contributing to a global pandemic. But that is not the same as blaming the Chinese people who themselves are victims of this crisis. This is a very basic lesson that we need to really get into to convey to everyone, and also to the Chinese population as well, that there is no need to harbor any hatred or resentment towards Americans, because there are in fact so many Americans in civil society who tried to help China during the crisis. So I think this is as part of that literacy that I talked about, that we just need to get the global citizenry, the global public, to make a distinction between the people of nations and the government of nations, and understand that at the end of the day, citizens never won war. But when we do go to war, it's because the politicians have led us into war. But all of us have a common interest in peace.
Elizabeth, Amy, anything that we are out of time? Anything to add on that?
Peace is a beautiful ending. So
Yes.
I'll
Yuen,
just
I think that
there.
was a perfect note to end on. Elizabeth, Amy, Yuen, thank you so much for giving so generously of your
Thank you.
time. It was truly a fabulous panel. I would stay on till 5 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, another 12 hours. But it was terrific. Thank you all so much. And thank you all for joining us. I see virtually all of you stayed to the end. All right, thanks all. Bye now.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.